welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Turn the Page, the Syosset Library podcast. I'm Barney Levantino, and I'm welcoming back today author Don Bentley. Don, welcome.
Well, thanks for having me again, Barney.
You know, I think this might be the third or fourth time you've been on the podcast, which is great. And you were here very recently, back in May, when we were talking about the newest of your Matt Drake books, Forgotten War. And today we're going to be talking about your entry into the Jack Ryan Jr. Series, Weapons Grade, Tom Clancy Weapons Grade.
Yeah, so it's actually my fourth Tom Clancy book in the and probably my last for this foreseeable future. So you get me for my swan song.
You know, you've been a busy guy this year. How many books did you come out with this year?
3. So this year was a little crazy, and it was about 2 years in the making. So about two and a half years ago, my editor for both the Clancy books and my Matt Drake book said, hey, going forward, the Clancy estate wants to do 3 books a year instead of 2. And so every other year there would be 2 in the series that you write. And he said, you know, I'm just telling you that because I know there's no way in the world you would want to try and write those, right? And I said, well, actually, maybe I would. And so he put me on this crazy schedule where basically for the last 2 years, I've been churning out a book every 5 months. And so the culmination of that is these 3 books in 1 year. So not crazy enough to be able to try and write 3 books in 1 year, but I guess I wrote about 2 1/4 over the course of 3 years.
You know, there are fans of a certain science fiction fantasy series who would love for the author of that series to hear your approach and how you cranked out 3 books in that period of time. But we won't name names.
Well, I think I'm still not as prolific as like Brandon Sanderson. And when you were talking about science fiction or fantasy, I think that guy cranks out a book like every 2 months or something. He's amazing.
Anyway, Weapons Grade, Jack Ryan Jr. Let's talk a little bit about Jack Ryan Jr. and where he's at this go round.
Yeah, so it's like I said, it's my 4th book in the series, and when I got the opportunity to start, it was with Target Acquired, and I really wanted to. I think part of the things you do as a writer when you come to a legacy series is say, you know, what is some untilled ground that I could start digging in and try and not so much put my own mark on the series as explore something that maybe other writers hadn't. And so for me, I really centered on Jack Ryan Jr. and kind of his growth as a person, as potentially a husband, as you know, what did he think at the point in his life where he'd achieved what he'd achieved. But his biggest idol is his father, and his father was married and had kids by the time he was his age. And so I spent a lot of time doing that, and that kind of culminated with my 3rd book that was Flashpoint. That was a big geopolitical thriller. When I turned it in, my editor said, you know, this is actually a Tom Clancy senior book, not a junior book, because the stakes were so high. And so I told him with Weapons Grade, I just want to write a smaller book from the standpoint of I have this idea about kind of a small town where things have gone wrong. And he's like, so kind of like a Jack Reacher, but with Jack Jr. And I said, yeah. And then as every time I write a book, as I go into it, the stakes suddenly become larger and larger and larger. And so Weapons Grade kind of follows two separate storylines, or what seem like separate. The first is Jack Ryan Jr. poking around in a small town in Texas when things go sideways. And then the bigger global overarching one is that the Iranians, the Israelis have just discovered that the Iranians are about to reach nuclear breakout, and because they had a clandestine enrichment facility that nobody knew about. And those 2 storylines intersect in kind of spectacular fashion in Weapons Grade.
The whole techno thriller part of the story carries the way these books always do. It's really an interesting story. But you touched a little bit on Jack Reacher Jr. as a person, and coming to grips with where he is and the prospect of impending parenthood for him means that his fiance might be become the guardian of her niece, and the concept of parenthood actually runs through a couple of ways through this book. You have Jack Ryan Jr. dealing with this potential, and then you have his dad, who is a father, but is also commander-in-chief and president, and that the tension in Ryan Sr. when he's faced with a situation where somebody's looking at him and he's learning that, my son is in the midst of this, and he needs to make a decision. As a parent, you would say, get my son out of harm's way. But as the sink, you got to say, do what you got to do. And that tension comes through in Jack Sr.
I appreciate you saying that. And that is something for me. So I served in the military. I was in the Army for 10 years, and my oldest, my son, was born shortly after September 11th. And so he is now a senior in college at Texas A&M, which figures pretty prominently in the book as well. And he is in the middle of getting his commission as a Marine Corps officer. And so, there's a saying that's something to the effect of old men don't fight wars. And the reason for that, I think, is that when you're an old man or a middle-aged man like me, it's your kids that are the ones who are going to fight that war. And it certainly brings a completely different perspective to everything, right? And so I wanted to, these books are meant to entertain, and they're meant to tell stories that keep you up late at night. But I think readers also resonate with veracity, whether that veracity is kind of the technical details that you alluded to before, or the fact that a father who is commander-in-chief doesn't surrender the fact that he is still a father, and he has to, and it wouldn't be real if those decisions didn't weigh on him differently when it's his son that's in the middle of the fray.
Exactly. And I'm not sure, I can't remember if it was you I was talking to or another author. I mean, I read a lot of these thrillers and, the spy stuff. That's kind of my wheelhouse. And I commented on the plausibility sometimes of stories, and when they get so far-fetched that you just kind of lose it. Whereas here, the events that bring Jack in seem plausible enough and realistic enough that you can follow, and the story kind of makes sense in that regard.
Well, I appreciate you saying that. It is, it's always a hard line to walk as a thriller writer. When I wrote my first book, Without Sanction, that was the first book in the Matt Drake series, a great friend of mine spent the majority of his Army career as a Delta Force operator. He retired from Delta Force as a sergeant major. And so there was a portion in that book that I had him review for me for technical accuracy. And when we got done, he said, we would never just send one guy to go meet with a spy in Syria. You know that, right? And I said, yeah, but was it a good story? And he said, it was a great story. And so I think that's part of when you pick up one of these books, you're willing to suspend your disbelief to a point,
Absolutely.
Right? And that's what the author's job is to do, is to push it to that point, but hopefully not make you as a reader say, oh man, I don't believe that. That's the line I think all of us are trying to walk.
The story itself, Jack gets involved with a group of mercenaries, South African mercenaries. And I think somewhere along the line, there was a comment that South African mercenaries has the most mercenaries per capita. How did that happen? And is it...
Yeah, so it was really interesting because I can't remember how I started down that rabbit hole, but I started looking at mercenaries. I think I may have been looking at just mercenaries fighting in Africa, and I started realizing that they were predominantly of South African origin. And then when you start digging into it, you realize that most of these people, as the mercenaries I've kind of depicted in my book, were originally within the South African military and either were kicked out or they didn't have a place for them, and they had one valuable skill, and it was to be, a soldier of fortune. And across the African continent, unfortunately, there were many opportunities to ply that trade, but the very interesting, or at least interesting to me point as a thriller writer is that many of those mercenaries now are in their 50s or even 60s because they can't do anything else, and they don't have, a retirement from their military service or the ability to stop. And so there were a couple of really interesting articles that I stumbled across about, and I forget off the top of my head the name of the country, but it was importing South African mercenaries to deal with their Islamic jihadist threat. And these guys were in their 50s or 60s and still trying to go to toe with these. And I'm like, man, that's fascinating. And so that kind of led me down the path of what would it, if you were a great commander, what would you do to try and take care of your guys that had served alongside you, that were still, and that kind of spun its way into this book. But it was definitely like many of the Clancy books of old too, certainly based on kernels of truth.
There's it's strange to say it, but there's almost a poignancy in the interactions between the mercenary commander and I guess the second in command, recognizing that we're on the back end of this thing, and the commander doing what he needs to do to try to take care of his men. I don't know if you're familiar with James Byrne, who came out with a series recently. He came out with the second book. It's the Desmond Limerick series. It's really a lot of fun. The character is just a fabulous, interesting guy. And in his second book, there's, again, the same situation where he's dealing with a mercenary who understands that his situation is really, really bleak, but his primary concern right now is, how do I take care of my men? I know I'm going to get it here, but how do I take care of my men? And it's an interesting thread that comes across. But anyway, the James Byrne Desmond Limerick series, I recommend it to you. It's a fun read, and the character is just a really, really different, interesting kind of guy. So
now I'll check it out.
We'll get back to Jack Ryan Jr. now. Jack's background is different. He's not a military guy, and he works with the campus. Talk a little bit about that for some of our readers who may not know about it, how it came about, what it's designed to do.
Yeah, so the campus is actually an invention by Tom Clancy, and so I think it was called Teeth of the Tiger was the first time the campus came into play, and in particular Jack Ryan Jr. joining it. And so it was, I believe he primarily brought it into play because he realized that Jack Ryan Sr. was president, and it was difficult to tell the stories he wanted to tell when he couldn't take his main protagonist and have him kick indoors anymore. And so he came up with the campus, which is kind of this off the books quasi member of the intelligence community that two other fan favorite characters, John Clark from Rainbow Six fame, or Without Remorse, which kind of tells John's story, and then Ding Chavez, who had been partnered with Clark from, I think, Without Remorse, or not Without Remorse, Clear and Present Danger. Both of them were original members of Rainbow Six and then members of the campus as well. And so what was always interesting to me, so Jack Ryan Jr., the president's son, originally joined the campus as kind of a financial analyst and kind of stumbled his way into more of a paramilitary role. But unlike everybody else who's an employee of the campus, he doesn't belong there from the standpoint of he doesn't have a background from the intelligence community, from the special operations community, even from the military. And so that was another area that I didn't feel like the other authors had touched on before. And so as I was writing, I'm like, what would a guy in his scenario think when he realizes he knows the only reason why he's even in this group is because his last name is Ryan. Mm-hmm. And so I think, if it were me, I'd have a bit of a chip on my shoulder of not only do I really belong here, but how do I prove to myself and the other legends that are my comrades that I do belong here? And so that is also something that I explored over the 4 books that I wrote in this series. And it also kind of comes to a head in Weapons Grade.
It does indeed come through, and he wears that skin. I think he's gotten more and more comfortable with it as the books have gone on, and he recognizes that, okay, maybe this is how it started, but I think he's become much more confident in his own abilities. notwithstanding that he seems to find himself in trouble all the time. But that makes it more fun. There's a whole lot of technical stuff in all of these books, and I know we've discussed earlier the need to try to draw a balance between that and the reader who's in it just for the thriller part of it. This book touches on an experimental weapons system, and my question to you is how much of your technical stuff in these books is fact, how much is fiction, how much of it is a little bit of both?
Yeah, so this one is actually a lot fact from the standpoint of, so I'm an aviation geek. I flew Apache helicopters in the Army. Most aviation geeks, their favorite airplane ever is the SR-71 Blackbird.
And I was going to say that's my next point.
Yeah.
There's a character in the book that's an inanimate object, but the SR-71 is indeed a character here.
And so I love that plane. I loved planes that go fast, and I love reading about planes that are trying to go faster. So the SR-71s is the fastest air-breathing plane, 50 or 60 years still after it was built. And so I sort of had this idea. I was really interested in hypersonics. It's been, kind of the topic du jour now of what do we do about hypersonic missiles? What do we do? And so there's this really interesting company, this startup company called Hermeus that is in Atlanta, and they're trying to make the first hypersonic jet airplane. And one of the ways they're paying for that is they're trying to make a hypersonic unmanned combat area vehicle, a UCAV, and they had just won some really big contracts from the Air Force for doing it. And they have this great series where they post their videos online of their engine firing, and they did this amazing podcast where they brought an actual SR-71 into the factory with their engineers for him to talk about what it was like flying the SR-71, which isn't hypersonic. It only goes to Mach 3, but it's still this incredible airplane. Well, his name is Bob Baer. And so when I looked at him, I thought, man, I would love to talk to that guy. And so I reached out to him, and this is where it's nice to write Tom Clancy books because that name opens a lot of doors. And I said, hey, can I interview you and talk to you about what it was like to fly the SR-71? And so, because I have this idea, and I spent an hour and a half on the phone with him, and it was maybe one of the most fascinating conversations I'd ever had. And so at the end, I said, you know what? I'm bringing back the SR-71 for this book I'm writing, Weapons Grade. Could I name a character after you? And he said, absolutely. And so the Bob Baer that's in the book is actually named for him. And he gave me like all kinds of incredible stories and what it was like to fly it. And so most of it, there are some mistakes I made in the book that Bob has already pointed out to me graciously. But the majority of it is fact and is based on the interviews I did with him. And there's an incredible journalist named Alex Hollings who writes for Popular Mechanics, and he has his own website called Sandbox News where he does all these neat aviation videos. He is actually reading the book now, and then he's going to moderate an interview between Bob and I where we talk about hypersonics, the Corvair, which is the UCAV in the book, and all of that great stuff. So that's going to be fantastic too. But a lot more in this book was fact than is usually, probably more often is fiction. So I'll say that.
That interview between the two of you sounds absolutely fascinating. I'm going to keep an eye out for that. I'd love to watch that. Here's another stupid question. Shouldn't a lot of this stuff be classified or what? I mean, it's like all this stuff is just wide open.
Yeah. So what's interesting is that most of the stuff, so the SR-71, the majority of stuff I put in there, obviously the plane is long since retired. And so Bob was very careful to draw the line between missions that he actually flew, which may or may not still be classified, and then kind of some commonly available data on the airplane that he could talk about. And what I wanted to do more than anything was just give the reader a sense of what it was like to sit in the cockpit.
You're taking the words out of my mouth, because I was telling you, as I'm reading the book, I'm feeling like I'm in the plane flying with him.
That's good, because I felt that way after I got done talking with him. And it's just, you don't, like, I flew a very advanced helicopter and had a lot of help flying it from the standpoint of there's so much now where the computer helps you, where you have autopilot, you have holds. And the SR-71, it was, still the wild, wild west when that was flying back there. And he said, there was no long program where you got to slowly ease into it. And he's like, you basically got 2 or 3 flights or whatever with an instructor, and then they told you to go figure it out. And so most of the people who flew that airplane had been, like Bob was an Air Force test pilot before he went and did that mission. But it really was, there's a part in the book that I stole from Bob that I thought just so perfectly characterized how much of that flying that plane was on the very ragged edge. And so you have this condition called unstarts, where the airflow in one of the engine gets interrupted. And so if you imagine this airplane going Mach 3 and one of the engines stop producing thrust, you get this incredible yaw rate, which means the nose spins. It's almost like trying to do a 90-degree turn. So imagine doing that at 50 miles an hour and figure out how much worse it would be at, 3,000 miles an hour or 1,800 miles an hour, whatever Mach 3 is. Well, when the airplane first came out, there was no indication which engine had actually unstarted, because what would happen is one would go out and the computer would automatically pull the other engine back, and you as the pilot would have to figure out which one had done the unstart and do the correct procedure. Otherwise, you would sabotage the only working engine. And so a little later, they put in a gauge that would help you do that. But Bob said in the beginning, the way he'd figure it out is whichever side of the canopy his head bounced off of, he knew it was the other engine. So if he hit the right side of the canopy, it was the number 1 engine that flamed out. And I'm like, oh my gosh, like only back then could you get away with people flying an airplane that much on the ragged edge. And it was just incredible.
A low-tech solution, but it worked.
Exactly.
No, but it's amazing because that plane is indeed, it's a character in this book.
Yeah.
And it's just, it's got a life of its own. It's just really fascinating. And he, as a character, is just, you're rooting for him the whole way.
I think he was less than thrilled at first because he read the first chapter and it starts like with Bob Bayer as a dinosaur. And he's like, I can't believe you said that. And then by the end, he's like, okay, I like my character. But thank you.
It was terrific. The book is Weapons Grade. It's a Jack Ryan Jr. novel, Tom Clancy universe, written by Don Bentley. Don, we talked earlier, you've been very, very busy. What's coming up for you next?
Yeah, so I have managed to hit the lottery twice, I guess. So the first time was being allowed to write the Clancy, write in the Clancy universe, and so now I actually get to take over the Vince Flynn, Mitch Rapp books for Kyle Mills. So he and I are going out on a book tour together, where Kyle's last book called Code Red for the Mitch Rapp universe, and my last book, Weapons Grade for Clancy. And then I am in the middle of writing my first Mitch Rapp book right now, which is still hard for me to wrap my mind around.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that one also. I'm a huge Mitch Rapp fan from way back, from book 1.
Me too.
And, I know, based upon what you've done with Matt Drake and what you've done with Jack Ryan Jr., that it's going to be a real thriller in every sense of the word. I'm really looking forward to that. You got a timetable on that?
Yeah, so there's a lot of really cool traditions that surround Vince Flynn and Mitch Rapp. So for instance, Kyle and I, our second stop, it's usually the first stop, is this little independent bookstore in Minneapolis. And the reason why they go there every year is because Vince self-published his first book called Term Limits. And apparently he was quite the salesman, because he went to this bookstore owner and said, if you carry my book, when I make it big, I'll kick off every tour in your little bookstore. And so they still do that. Well, another kind of tradition around it is the books always come out in September. I believe it's September 11th. And so my first Mitch Rapp book should come out in September of 2024.
Okay. I'm going to look forward to that. And I'm hoping you'll be able to come back and talk about that one as well.
Absolutely.
Good luck with this. You've done a terrific job with the Tom Clancy universe. The books have all been fabulous. And I love the Matt Drake series. And as I said, I'm really looking forward to seeing what you're going to do with Mitch Rapp. So
thank you so much.
Thanks for stopping in. And I'll look forward to talking to you again. And take a little breather. 3 books inside of like about 6 or 7 months coming out is take a rest.
Well, thank you. I will. Thanks so much for having me, Barney.
Thanks for joining us. And we'll talk to you soon.
it's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.